Hi, I'm Venkat. So here we are going to see SAP R3 architecture. So in SAP R3 architecture, we have three separate layers, or we used to call servers. So first one we used to call presentation server, presentation layer, or we can say SAP logon pad, SAP logon, or SAP GI. You can call with any name. Okay, so this one your SAP GI. Second box in the middle, whatever we have, this one we used to call application server or application layer. Third one we used to call database server or database layer. When it comes to the SAP GUI, for example, if you have 1,000 consultants, so we need 1,000 SAP GUIs. See, we as a system admin, we are not going to install on each individual system. What we are going to do, we are going to install in our system, and we are going to configure in SAP GUI, we are going to configure all the system details. Once if we configure all the systems in the SAP GUI, so it is going to generate one file. So that file path we are going to share to all the consultants. We are going to keep that file path in the network, and we are going to share that. And we are whatever the installation procedure is there, how to install your SAP GUI. So that SAP GUI media or software. So in place of software, we have to call media. So that SAP GUI media path we have to keep in the network, and we have to share to the consultants. So what those people are going to do, they are simply going to that particular media path, clicking on that as per the instructions. So there, instead of configuring each systems one by one, so whatever we configured, so that configured file path they are going to specify. So where they have to choose that path also we are going to provide through mail. So like this, we are going to install your SAP GUI. Okay. So when it comes to the application server, so these application servers, based on the requirement, we can go for up to 98 application servers. The first one we used to call ASCS, ASCS. Second one we used to call PAS. Third one onwards we used to call SAS1, SAS2, SAS3 up to SAS 97. That means totally we can deploy, we can install up to 98 application servers based on the requirement. Okay, next one is the database server. So database server or database layer is the only one here. Try to remember these points. SAP JS, if you have 10,000 consultants, 10,000 SAP JS are required. But installation and configuration, everything we are doing at one place, but sharing the details. Okay, all the other consultants except the basis team. So they are going to install SAP GUI as per the screenshots, and they're providing the configuration file path. Once they choose that configuration file path, so all the configured information we are going to get by default. Okay. So now this, so what is the purpose of this SAP GUI? From the SAP GUI, we are going to connect to the SAP application server. So if you want to connect to the SAP application server, we are using SAP GUI. So in the SAP GUI, what we need to do, what we need to provide to connect to the application server. So if I want to connect to the SAP application server, in SAP GUI, we need to provide some minimum inputs. What are the inputs which we need to provide? So during the SAP server installation, during the SAP application server or SAP application layer installation, we need to provide something called SAP SID. SAP SID we have to provide during SAP server installation. And we need to choose SAP instance number or system number. And third one is, so we are going to configure one IP address before we are going to install this application server. So here during the SAP server installation, whatever we are providing, like SAP SAP SID, SAP system identifier, system number or instance number, both are the same. So that instance number and host name or IP address, we have to provide both here. So whatever we provided here, SAP SID, instance number, host name and IP address, the same three details we need to provide in the SAP GA. So once if we provide this one, then only we can connect from SAP GA to application server through DIAG protocol. Okay. For example, if our application server is down, then when you are connecting from the SAP GA to SAP application server, will get the error partner not reached. Means application server is not started, or else whatever we provide in the SAP GA, that information is wrong. So that is the reason. Now, from the SAP GA, so this is about R3 architecture. So from SAP GA, we are connecting to application server. So in the SAP application server, we have different services. So when installed successfully your SAP application server, in the SAP application server, you are going to get different services or different programs. So what are the different services? So we get the different services like message server, dispatcher, work process. So all these services we are going to get during the installation. Now, whenever you connect from the SAP GI to SAP application server, first your request is going to communicate to dispatcher. So dispatcher is the service. Dispatcher is the service. This dispatcher service is going to receive the request from the SAP GUI and keeps the request in the dispatcher queue based on the first in, first out. Once if it keeps the request in the dispatcher queue, then this dispatcher is going to check the availability of the work process. So here we have the different types of work process like dial work process, background work process, spool work process, NQ work process, update work process. So what is a work process? Work process is nothing but a program. What this program is going to do? So different work processes are going to do different activities. So your dialog process is going to execute the program in the foreground. So if you want to execute the same program in background, so background work process is going to execute that program. So if you want to give any printout, so that printout related work process is spool work process. So if you want to update any records, so before we are going to update, so we need to log that record. Before we are going to update, we have to log the record, because once if we log, other people are not going to do any changes. So first we have to log that record. To lock or unlock the record, or to lock or unlock the tables, we use NQ work process. Update work process means it is going to update the records at the database level permanently. So each work process has its own purpose. Okay, we have separate classes for each work process. Okay, if you know, we should know as a system admin, it is mandatory you should know in and out about each work process. Okay, right. Once we connect to the from SAPJ to application server, first your request is going to receive by dispatcher, and dispatcher keeps a request in the dispatcher queue, and dispatcher is going to check the availability of the work process. Why the people are connecting from the SAPJ to application server? To run an application, to execute a applications. So to execute that one, who is going to execute that applications or programs? Workflows are going to execute. That is the reason dispatcher is going to keep all the requests in the dispatcher queue based on first in, first out. And dispatcher is going to check the availability of the work process, which work process is available. Then so this dispatcher is going to assign this request, which is waiting in the queue, to the available work process. Once the request is assigned to the work process, work process. Now your dispatcher job is over. Now your request is assigned to this particular work process. Now this work process is going to executing your task or executing your program. So to execute that one, so by this dialogue process, first it is going to check to execute that particular program or application, whether that user has authorizations or not. How do you know that whether the user is authorized to execute that particular program or application? So that user has something called authorizations, permissions. So once if you connect from the SAP GUI to application server, so to connect to the application server, it is going to ask something called user ID and password. So if you enter the user ID and password, then only you are going to log into the system. Once if you enter your user ID and password, that user ID and password and that user, whatever the user has the authorizations, all the details are going to store something called user context. In the user context, user information is going to exist. What exists in the user context? In the user context, it contains user ID, password, user authorizations, and whatever the user is accessed the screens or applications, that information exists in the user context. Now, before the task is processed by your dialogue process, so first system checks whether this user is authorized to execute this particular program or not. So to check that authorization, whether it is authorized or not, the user information and user authorizations exist in the user context. This, whatever the data which exists in the user context, the data is going to copy from here to the your work process memory. Okay, so user details are going to copy from here to work process. Now here it checks whether the user is authorized or not. If it is authorized, then your dialogue process is going to execute the task. So while it is executing the program, so here we have something called task handler. For example, if I want to execute a program, so internally it is internally processed by finally who is going to execute that program? Work process are going to execute the program. So before it is going to execute the program, internally it contains three tasks. One is screen processor, then a web interpreter, then database interface. This screen processor, for example, whenever you want to check your results, examination results, what we are going to do? We are going to log into the system, or we are going to the Google. We are clicking on the link, web link, and once if you open that link, so it is going to ask your registered your number, okay, and date of birth. Okay, so once if we provide that one, or else I will give one more example like ATM. For example, if you want to perform any ATM transaction, first we are inserting the card. When you are insert the card, internally system is going to executes the program. It checks whether this card barcode is exists with the internal system database or not. Whether this barcode is matching with the existing system or not. For example, instead of ATM card, bank ATM card, if you insert the supermarket card, it won't accept. Okay. So when you insert the card, internal system is going to check your barcode, then validity of the that card, everything it is going to check. If everything is okay, then you will get one more screen, one more message saying that select the type of account. So before giving the output, it is processing. That one we used to call process before output. Before it is going to give the output, enter, select the type of account, it is internally processed. So that one we used to call process before output. After providing the inputs, for example, I selected a savings account. Again, it is going to, system is going to check whether this user account, whether user account type is savings or current or fixed account, whether it is matching or not. After providing the inputs, again it is going to execute and again it is going to give the output. That one we used to call process after input. That means before it is going to execute an application, system checks, system is going to process. Screen processor means before it is going to give the output, internally something is processed. After providing the input, again it is processing something. So that one, that process is performed by screen processor. So the screen processor we have to place in the first box. Okay, screen processor. Then ABAP interpreter. ABAP interpreter, what it is going to do, whatever the application or program code is there, source code, that code line by line it is going to execute. So that is a job of ABAP interpreter. So while it is executing your programming code, if there any select statement is there in the programming code, the select statement purpose is to get the data from the database, to fetch the data from the database. If there any select statement is there in your programming code, then your database interface is going to check the selected select statement required data, whether it exists in the R3 buffer or not. If the data exists in the R3 buffer, means R3 buffer means the storage area, temporary storage area in the application server. If the data is there in the buffer, R3 buffer, then it fetches the data from the R3 buffer and gives the result to the work process. Once, if it returns the result to the work process, then whatever the user information, like user context data is there, the data again it is going to copy into the user context. So if the data exists in the R3 buffer and it fetches the data from the R3 buffer and returns the result to the work process returns the result to dispatcher. Now dispatcher gives the output. If the data doesn't exist in the R3 buffer, then your database interface is going to communicate to your database through database client. So we have to install this database client in the application server. So whenever you are installing the application server, it is going to ask our database client also. Okay, we don't need to install database client separately. Okay. So now your database interface, if the data doesn't exist in the R3 buffer, then your database interface is going to communicate through database through DB client. So DB client contains the drivers to connect to that database. So your database interface communicates with the database through DB client and fetches the data from the database into the database buffer. From the database buffer, it is going to keep the data into the R3 buffer. From the R3 buffer, it is going to return the result to the work process. From the work process returns the result to dispatcher. Dispatcher gives the output. So whatever the time which it is going to take, like dispatcher queue time, then we use it to call copying user context data. For example, we want to copy the user context data into the work process memory. So that one we used to call roll in. Again, if we copy user context data from the work process memory into the user context, that one we used to call rollout. Roll in and roll out time, dispatcher queue time, this program execution time, database execution time, response CPU time. So the entire from the except SAP GUI time, except SAP GUI time, once after connecting to the dispatcher, whatever the time it is going to take for each area altogether, it should not exceed more than 1000 to 1200 milliseconds. 1000 to 1200 milliseconds. So that one we used to call average response time. Average response time. So, for example, your request is in the dispatcher queue. How long it has to wait in the dispatcher queue? So, when you are going to say it is expensive, if it is whatever the request which is waiting in the dispatcher queue, if the waiting time is more than 200 milliseconds, that one we used to call expensive. Expensive. Similarly, to roll in and roll out, it should not take more than 50 milliseconds. Like that, CPU time, database time, ABAP execution time. Okay, so for all these times, altogether should not take more than 1000 to 1200 milliseconds. That one we used to call average response time. So this is about your SAP R3 architecture. If you know each and every area, whatever we discussed, like your what is the functionality of the dispatcher and dispatcher queue, what are the functionality of all the work process. If you know each and everything about the entire application server, so that is nothing but your SAP S4HANA administration. If you know each and everything which is related to your database, so that is nothing but your HANA database or Oracle or any database. Okay. So in the entire syllabus, so S4HANA administration means whatever it is there in the application server, if you know A to Z about this application server, that is nothing but your entire administration, S4HANA administration. If you know A to Z about the database, that one is called database administration. Okay. So here, what type of questions they may ask? Sometimes they will ask one question. So what is the functionality of the dispatcher? If the dispatcher is not started, then where we are going to check? And what will be the reason for not starting the dispatcher? How do you know that whether dispatcher is started or not? Then where you are going to check the dispatcher queue statistics? How many requests are processed? How many are in the queue? How many are waiting? Okay, like that. If you want to know all these details, so where you are going to check? Okay. Now, so they may ask one more question. What is the difference between SAP client and DB client? So here we have SAP client. SAP client contains the business data. SAP client is nothing but contains the business. Here client is nothing but a company or organization. So company or organization. So that contains the business data. What about the data DB client, database client? So database client. So this database client contains the drivers. So these drivers are used to connect to your database. Okay, that is about your SAP R3 architecture. Thank you.